Right. So we're gonna go ahead and get started. Um, so my name is Aaron David. I'm the director of plant ecology, and today I'm pleased to introduce today's speaker, Victoria Vo. Victoria is our 2024 to 25 Maxwell Hanrahan intern. Uh, Victoria is a true Florida woman. She grew up in St. Augustine and graduated from the University of Florida in 2024 with a BS in botany. As an undergrad, Victoria gained a lot of experience in pollination ecology, working in Dr. Rachel Mellinger's lab, and worked on a variety of plant pollinator systems, including native flatwoods, as well as in agriculture settings, working with blueberry cultivars. Victoria joined Archibald's plant ecology program in August and is an absolute beast in every way. She not only knows pretty much all the plants here, but she can tell you about all the insects and the herbs as well. And as you'll see from her independent project that she'll be presenting today, she really took advantage of her background in pollination ecology and the resources here at Archibald to design and execute a really important study that informs our understanding of how the pollination ecology of this rare Highlands Goldenaster limits its populations and may ultimately contribute to its population decline. Her project dovetails nicely with our long-term research on the species and helps clarify the conservation challenges the species faces. Next week, she'll be taking this talk on the road and presenting at the Florida Native Plant Society meeting in Gainesville. And then after her internship, I'm thrilled that she'll be continuing on with pollination ecology as a master's student at the University of North Texas, working with Dr. Eleanor Lichtenberg. And with that, I will hand it over to Victoria.
Well, thank you for the introduction, Aaron. As you said, my name is Victoria Vo, and my project is on the pollination biology and mating system of the Highlands Goldenaster, Chrysopsis highlandsensis. If you haven't seen this plant before, let me be the first to introduce you to the Highlands Goldenaster. It was described relatively recently in 2002 by Delaney and Wonderland, and it is listed as state endangered, restricted to 3 counties in Florida, Polk, Highlands, and Glades counties. It inhabits sandy gaps in scrubby flatwoods / pine flatwoods and on disturbed roadsides. And it lives a mostly monocarpic life cycle. So as a seedling, it'll stay in this vegetative rosette stage for about 4 years until becoming reproductive and growing these tall flowering stalks that will bloom between October and January. Monocarpic, meaning that it will die after the first bloom, but a few plants are polycarpic, where they will continue to survive and reproduce for multiple years. And we know that they have declining populations, and like many other plants in the Florida scrub, it suffers from habitat loss. It prefers sandy gaps that are maintained by prescribed burns. And we know from over 2 decades of demography study that it has a low germination rate and recruitment. So knowing that it has poor reproduction, I wanted my project to focus on barriers to reproduction. For example, pollination. Is it receiving enough visits to become fertilized? Pollen-pistil interaction. Is it receiving the right kind of pollen? And seed development. Are the seeds viable and able to germinate into seedlings? Spoilers. I also wanted to see if these barriers existed in both habitat types. We have the scrub that is mostly favors polycarpic plants. So these are the plants that will produce fewer flowers per bloom season, but it will survive for multiple flowering seasons. Then we have the more disturbed roadsides that favor monocarpic plants. These are the ones that will have bigger blooms but die after that first season. So it's important to see how these barriers affect plants with different life cycles, especially since most of them will die after their first flowering and only have 1 flowering event for their entire lifetime. So with this background, I wanted to see, I had this overall question of, does pollination biology limit reproductive success in scrub and road habitat? And then I have 3 sub-questions. Number 1, does Chrysopsis highlandsensis rely on pollinators for reproductive success? Most asters do. They are insect pollinated. But there is some evidence of apomixis where they can produce seeds without fertilization. Then number 2 is Chrysopsis highlandsensis self-compatible. It's variable in the family Asteraceae, with self-compatibility evolving and reversing multiple times. Number 3, who are the primary pollinators and how frequently do they visit? Asters are normally pollinated by generalists, which are more abundant, but they may introduce outside heterospecific pollen from different plant species. I expect this with the Highlands Goldenaster because its bloom overlaps with other similar yellow asters like Chrysopsis and Baldwina. So to answer these questions, I have 2 approaches, the first one being the pollination manipulation experiment, and the second being a pollinator survey. Both of these were conducted at Archibald Biological Station at the southern end of the Lake Wales Ridge in Highlands County. And I looked at 4 subpopulations, 2 roadsides and 2 scrub. Here's me in a roadside population, and here are the plants right on the edge of the road and the scrub. So for the first approach, the pollination manipulation experiment, I have 4 treatments. And the main goal of this approach was to look at the mating system of the Highlands Goldenaster. So the first treatment being open, where pollinators are free to visit the flowers. And the second one is closed, where I excluded pollinators using bags. So these 2 treatments could be compared to look at the effect of pollinators on seed development. Then I have 2 hand pollinations. The first one being cross, where I took pollen from different plants within the same site. And then the other one is self, where I took pollen from the same individual, but using different flower heads. So these 2 could be compared to look at self-compatibility. So at every site, I selected 10 plants, and each plant received all 4 treatments, 1, 2, 3, 4, on different flower heads. And I conducted the hand pollinations once a week, and I ran this experiment twice, once in the early season and once in the late season. And when the flower heads were done developing, I collected, counted, and sorted the seeds by viability under a microscope. Overall, I observed 320 flower heads. For the second approach, the pollinator survey, the goal was to determine species composition and visitation rate. I conducted 15-minute surveys weekly at each site during bloom, and I recorded flower density and weather for each visitation period. Overall, I observed for 525 minutes, saw 100 individual insects, and observed 22 species. So here's me at the beginning of my project with the developing flowering stalks. They haven't quite started budding yet, but I'm looking very, very happy. Here's me at the end of my project, counting seeds in the lab forever. And here's an example of what I might have seen under the microscope. So here on the left, there is a non-viable seed that's all shriveled up. In the middle, can you guess? It's a trick question. It's also non-viable. I use these squeeze tests to determine whether the seeds are viable. So if I use my forceps and squeeze the seed and it collapsed, it would be non-viable. And here on the right is a viable seed, which didn't fall under the pressure of the squeeze test. So going to the results of my study, we have this. Originally, I was going to compare all 4 treatments, but I had some problems with the hand pollinations. The composite flowers have individual florets that develop at different rates. So only hand pollinating once a week wasn't enough to reach every floret and hand pollinate them. But we can still compare the open and closed treatments. And as you can see, Chrysopsis highlandsensis relies on pollinators for viable seeds, even if only about 25% of the seeds were viable in the open treatment. Just comparing the 2 hand pollinations, we see that the plant has partial self-compatibility. It is still able to produce viable seeds when selfing, but just not as many as cross-pollination. And for the pollinator survey, I found that Chrysopsis highlandsensis is mainly pollinated by Bombus impatiens, the common eastern bumblebee. Out of the 22 species, these are just the top 5. We have the bumblebee, leafcutter bees, honeybees, a Garon bee fly, and a metallic green sweat bee. These are all mostly generalists that are found on other flower types as well. And another result of the pollinator survey is the difference between habitat types. I found that there is a higher visitation rate in the roadside than in the scrub. And this shows a greater shift toward monocarpy, where in the roadsides, especially as habitat loss continues and we lose more scrub and create more disturbed habitats, this is important. And it has a relatively low visitation rate. So in the roadside, if you observed one flower head for 1 minute, you would see 0.03 around there of a visit. So pretty low. And so these were the planned reproductive barriers that I was looking for in my project. And but out in the field, I also encountered other reproductive barriers. For example, herbivory, especially that of the leaf-footed bugs. So there it is in the picture. Um, so in the late season, around December and January, I noticed these leaf-footed bugs that were landing on these flower heads that were in the seed development stage after bloom, and then they would fall off. And I also noticed seeds that would have little holes in them, possibly also from the herbivory. So as you can guess, it's probably bad for reproduction if the seeds are not actually like developing all the way and they have little holes in them. And another barrier that I also wanted to mention that out of the 320 flower heads that I was observing, about 13% were affected by herbivory. And I also noticed herbivory in the form of ants. So about 16% of the flower heads I observed ants going in and out of the florets, possibly robbing nectar that would be used to attract other pollinators. And I also observed these Florida harvester ants that would pick up the fallen seeds and take them away, possibly a form of seed predation, which I imagine can be bad for seedling recruitment and germination if they're being dragged off to ant mounds and getting eaten. But going back to my main study and the original 3 questions, in conclusion, I found that Chrysopsis highlandsensis does rely on pollinators for reproductive success, despite infrequent visits, and that it can be pollinated within an individual, but may be affected by inbreeding depression, and that it is primarily pollinated by generalist bees, especially bombus impatiens, that common eastern bumblebee. So I would like to send you all home with a take-home message for the entire presentation, and it's that Highlands Goldenaster has several reproductive barriers that likely limit population growth and complicate an already deteriorating conservation outlook. I would like to say thank you to everyone at Archibald for helping supporting me, especially Dr. Aaron David and the Plant Ecology Lab. And I'd like to thank again the Maxwell Hanrahan Foundation for funding my project. And with that, are there any questions? Oh, okay.
All right. There you go.
Great talk, great project. I was curious about the polycarpy in the scrub. You said there was greater frequency of that in the scrub habitat. Am I right there?
There is a greater frequency of them in the scrub habitat.
Okay. Is that a life history adaptation that somehow you think it enables them to have greater persistence in scrub, or what's the significance of that?
I feel like in the scrub, they are less at risk of like getting run over in the roadsides, so they can afford to have that kind of like slow and grow life cycle where they can like slowly produce flowers every season, compared to the roadsides where they're like, we got to get these flowers out, we got to bloom right now, and then they'll just die.
I think if I was reading it right, you said that they received more visits from pollinators on the roadside as compared to in the scrub. So wouldn't that imply that more disturbed habitats would be better for their reproductive success? Or am I misunderstanding that?
I feel like it's kind of showing how they're adapting to the roadsides. They're like moving towards this monocarpic lifestyle of being in the roadsides. And it's kind of, I think, for the insects, it may be easier for them to access the plants in the roadside. Because when I notice the roadside sites, all the plants are kind of like in a row on the road. So the pollinators could just go like boom, boom, boom down the line. But in the scrub, they get kind of lost because there's other plants also blooming, like the Bideopsis and the Baldwina that I mentioned. So they're kind of just like all over the place. So that's why I think in the roadside, they might have higher visitation than in the scrub.
Great talk, Victoria. I was curious about the ants that you mentioned at the end, because you kind of presented it as like a potential like herbivory barrier to reproduction. But if they're taking seeds and stealing nectar, could they possibly be pollinating or like caching the seeds to help them disperse elsewhere?
So we're still looking at the harvester ant seed predation. We're not really sure what they do with them yet. Hannah Masterlet like made some observations on like how they carry them to the nest. But we're not sure what they're doing with it. But for the nectar robbing, at least, I imagine that if they're taking nectar away from pollinators, like because ants are not very great pollinators, they're not very hairy and they can't collect the pollen like bees do. I imagine that like if bees like come to these flowers and they're like, oh, there's like no nectar here. These flowers stink. So and then they would go like to other flowers. That's what I imagine their effect on pollination is.
Yeah, is this working? I was sort of impressed by the fact that it seems to be evolving practically instantly to differing conditions along the roadside and in the scrub. And it could be that along the roadsides, it's just better growing conditions. For one thing, fire lanes in the roads, they're actually water reservoirs because there are a lot fewer roots there. And also it's more exposed. So maybe the plants grow really well and then they go into hyper reproduction. But if growth is repressed in the scrub situations, maybe they just don't grow as well. So that they have a sort of proximal adaptation, which is to produce some flowers every year, but not go all out. And you see that in garden flowers sometimes. If you give them perfect conditions, you get this huge plant. Sunflowers do this. But if you don't give them good conditions, they sort of hang on and keep on producing for a while. So maybe there's a sort of proximal growth explanation that's associated with this difference too.
Right. Yeah, I didn't even think about that, but I did. The plants in the scrub are a lot more weedier. They're like skinnier and a lot shorter than the flowering stalks out on the roadside. So that supports that. Yeah. Yeah.
Plants in the scrub are smaller and it's exactly what you just, they don't go all around. Yeah. Get some online. All right, I'm like in this cabinet. We have one from Eric Mangus. Very cool results on pollination and herbivory and nice presentation. What do your pollination findings imply for the gene flow and population differentiation in Chrysopsis?
So I was only able to look at the archbold populations, and I'll be honest, they're a little closer to each other than I would have liked. But it's still interesting that there were differences in the cross pollinations within the site. So I think that it shows maybe that the gene flow is working, I guess, if there is a difference between the cross and self-pollinations, but I'm not too sure.
And we have one from Hannah Masterlet. Did you notice differences in the species composition of pollinators between the scrub and roadside sites?
So I did whip up a little graph on that, and there wasn't too much. I think it was mainly the bumblebees that were pulling the roadside visitations like way up. So for some reason, those bumblebees just really are able to find the plants on the roadside, or they just really like the roadside plants more. So, but as for like the species composition, it was kind of the same. It was just more bumblebee visits on the roadside that kind of affected everything.
We have a few more online. This one's from Ben. How large of an issue are the leaf-footed bugs on the populations?
So, like I said, about 13% of my flower heads were affected by herbivory, which means I would show up and see if my flower heads, like check on them to see if they were like done and if they were like poofing up into seeds yet, and then they would just be gone. because the leaf-footed bugs would just like eat it up. But when I was out there, I did notice that like I would like go to a flower head, and if there were flower heads in that stage at the in that right season, they were pretty frequent, the leaf-footed bugs, like all over it, and they would like fly between them. So I think it is an issue because each flower head has like hundreds of seeds in it. So losing so many flower heads from herbivory would really reduce the number of seeds that actually go out to be dispersed.
And then one more online question. This is from Amartya. If these asters grow better in roadsides because of more visitation or water, why are they endangered? Is it because of shrinking scrub habitat loss?
I think so, because they're only in that one part of the Lake Wales Ridge and also the bombing range ridge. They have a kind of they live in a kind of rare habitat in the, like the pine flatwoods and the scrubby flatwoods. You don't see a lot of like big open sandy gaps that they prefer. So I think the habitat loss comes from like a lack of prescribed burns that create and open up these gaps for them to live in, which is why they prefer the roadsides, because it's like, oh, there's already a nice open gap for me.
Yeah, I think this species really likes fire, like a lot of fire. That's part of it. All right. Well,
one more follow-up question.
Okay.
Have you ever attempted pest control to control the leaf-footed bugs?
I know the leaf-footed bugs are also like a big agricultural pest, but I kind of don't want to risk it, especially with all of the native pollinators that it relies on. Putting like pesticides on these rare plants would probably really hit the pollinators hard. And as we know now, that they really need those pollinators to produce seeds.
all right. Well, let's give Victoria a round of applause.